Early in 2019, I took a one-day trip from Canberra to Thredbo. I walked at Mt Kosciuszko and then came back in the same day. I was planning on setting out on Friday afternoon to get to Thredbo the same day, an itinerary which turned out to be wishful thinking. But when checking the weather report, I saw there were storms in the hills between Canberra and Cooma. I foolishly thought I could somehow get lucky and sneak through, and with my wet weather gear, I assumed I could stay dry and be able to protect my camping gear from the wet. I was totally wrong. About 40 minutes outside Canberra, I was hit by a thunderstorm that turned into a massive downpour, climaxing in hail and torrential rain. All the traffic pulled over to the side of the road because you could hardly see 10 meters in front of you. I waited on the shoulder of the road, getting more and more soaked. After 5 minutes, it rolled past, but the damage was done. I was soaked and so was my gear, so bedraggled and moody, I headed back to Canberra to dry out my sleeping bag overnight and try again tomorrow. The next morning, after the false start, I was on my way towards Jindabyne. The road from Canberra to Jindabyne is pretty nice. It's mostly farmland spotted with various boutique stores and cellar doors and small towns. As you get closer to Cooma, the hills begin to grow from the formerly flat grassland, and after Cooma, tall rocks sprout from the ground to form small clusters, letting you know you are really in the alpine territory now. Snow gums are one of the most distinct parts of the Snowy Mountains. These eerie, stunted, pale gum trees form twisting copses thick with underbrush, but beautiful. From Jindabyne, you head deeper into the mountains, where the bush gets thick and the roads get windy. It's serene and meditative. Once at Thredbo, if you want to walk up Mt Kosciuszko, you need to buy a ticket to ride the chairlift. Otherwise, you'll have to climb the difficult path up the mountainside to the beginning of the walking track. The walking path itself begins fairly levelly and isn't much more than a casual stroll at first. Apparently, Mt Kosciuszko is actually pronounced Kosciuszko, but us Australians bastardize it into Kosciuszko. I got to the chairlift at 2:30 and the lift stopped at 4:30 at that time of year. The steel graded walkway that leads to Mt Kosciuszko is about 14 kilometers and snakes between lesser peaks on its way to the highest mountain in Australia. I passed by probably about 50 or so hikers on the way to the summit. The sun was still high in the sky and the rocks made spectacular scenery. Ravens, or maybe crows, I don't really know the difference, swarmed the mountainside in great flocks, screeching incoherently when disturbed. You can see wildflowers along the side of the track if you're there at the right time of the year. As a young teenager when I first walked this track, probably more than 10 years ago now, there were furrows in the thick alpine grass, crisscrossing the ground under the walkway. These paths were made by small marsupials, most likely the broad-toothed rat, or an Antechinus or echidna. One of the most vivid things that I remember about that trip that I took when I was younger was that I saw an echidna. It was slowly ambling through one of the grass tracks underneath the walkway. I stood suspended above the oblivious or uncaring animal and watched it slowly wander off into the grass. I walked past Lake Kutabatamba, which is pretty spectacular, nestled in a deep valley. The mountainside on the opposite side of the lake was still crusted with snow, even though it was the middle of summer. Since it was late in the day, most of the other hikers were on their way back by the time I was nearing the summit. When I reached the peak, I had it all to myself. It was totally deserted, and I took my time, eating muesli bars and enjoying the view. The horizon disappeared into a blur, and I could hardly distinguish the difference between the blue sky and the hazy blue mountains. By the time I was heading back, the sun was setting, and the high stone tors cast dramatic figures as their shadows slinked down the sides of the mountain. The sun was to my back, and I stopped to fill my water bottle from the creek that I can only assume was full of snowmelt and hopefully free of any parasites. I haven't become sick yet though. Once I reached the chairlift, which wasn't running anymore, it was almost 7 p.m. I began descending, following a 5-kilometer switchback path that led down the sides of the mountain to Thredbo. After I regained my bike and began riding back to Jindabyne, the sun was almost set. When I was a child, we would often come to the Snowy Mountains in the off-season and would stay in a stone cabin. I remember where the cabin was and took a detour on the way back to see the place. It brought back a wave of memories of the summers that I spent there when I was about 10 years old. I ate a late dinner in the pub in Jindabyne and began the long ride back to Canberra. It was almost dark when I left. I had left for this trip at 10 a.m. in the morning and severely underestimated the amount of time it would take to get me to Thredbo, to walk up the mountain, and then to get back to Canberra. I reached home by probably 11 p.m. My legs ached the next morning, and I enjoyed a good sleep in.